In 1492, a pope drank the blood of 3 children as medicine. It's the truth, that's not an exaggeration. Pope Innocent VIII was on his deathbed, and his personal physician, one of the most respected doctors in Rome, came up with a final plan. Bring in 3 young boys, take their blood, feed it to the Pope. The chronicler Stefano Infraser recorded what happened next. The boys actually died, and the Pope died anyway, and the doctor, he kept practicing, because what he prescribed wasn't considered desperate, it was just medicine.
That story is just the beginning of something much bigger. For over 300 years, the kings, queen, popes, and emperors of Europe consumed human flesh, human blood, and powdered human skull. Not in secret, not in shame, it sat on their pharmacy shelves, prescribed by name, sold over the counter to anyone who with the money to buy it. They called it corpse medicine. And this is its history.
If you love this kind of royal history, gently tap that like button.
Let's open the archives. So what were they actually taking? Because this wasn't symbolic. Royal physicians wrote down specific recipes, and honestly, they're hard to read.
Powdered human skull for headaches, seizures, and anything involving the brain. Physicians ground it to dust and mixed it into wine or chocolate. And the thing is, this goes way back. First century Rome, Pliny the Elder was already documenting people drinking gladiator blood as a cure for epilepsy. By the 1500s, that same idea had been polished into a full medical system, endorsed by people who should have known better. Francis Bacon backed it. Robert Boyle, the man we literally called the father of modern chemistry, called it one of the most useful medicines he knew of. So we're not talking about village healers or superstitious peasants here.
Human fat got rendered down into ointment for joint pain and gout. Where did it come from? Executioners. Across Germany and France, they'd collect fat off bodies of the condemned and sell it straight to the apothecaries. Apparently, it was a perk of the job.
Then you had mummy powder, actually ground up Egyptian mummies, shipped to Europe by crate. In 1586, a merchant named John Sanderson hauled 600 pounds of the stuff back to London in one trip. 600 pounds! That's not a niche curiosity, that's a supply chain.
And King Francis I of France never went anywhere without his personal stash. He kept a pouch of mummy powder mixed with rhubarb on him at all times. Battlefield, court, diplomatic visits didn't matter. The King of France with ground up human remains hanging around his neck every day of his life.
In 1618, the London Pharmacopoeia was basically the official medical textbook for every licensed doctor in England, listed mummy as an approved remedy. So no, this wasn't just fringe, it was institutional.
Which raises the obvious question, why did any of them think this worked?
Because they had a theory, and at the time, it held together for them. A Swiss physician named Paracelsus, probably the most influential medical thinker of the 1500s, taught that every human body carries what he called a vital spirit. The idea, sometimes called vitalism, was that this life force doesn't just vanish when somebody dies. It stays in the flesh, the bones, and the blood. And if you consume those remains, particularly from someone young, healthy, and killed suddenly, that energy transfers to you.
The sudden death part was everything. A soldier cut down on the battlefield, a criminal dropped at the scaffold. Their vital spirit was supposedly still locked inside because it never had time to fade. That's why they wanted skulls from men who died violently. That's why they wanted the blood fresh and warm. There was a system behind it.
Paracelsus wasn't operating in the shadows either. Universities taught his framework. Scholars debated it. Medical textbook carried it for 200 years. At the time, this was thought it's cutting-edge medicine.
So you've got the ingredients, you've got the theory, but how far did it actually go?
Farther than you think.
In 1660, Charles II took the English throne. His father had been beheaded 11 years earlier during the Civil War, and now the monarch was restored. This wasn't the Dark Ages. Restoration England was the era that launched modern British science. Charles himself founded the Royal Society. He had his own laboratory at Whitehall Palace, and he paid £6,000 to a physician named Jonathan Goodard for one recipe: 5 pounds of crushed human skull, 2 pounds of dried vipers, 2 pounds of hartshorn, 2 of ivory, all minced and distilled into liquid taken by the drop. People stopped calling it Goddard's drops pretty quickly. They called it the King's drops.
Charles kept a supply in his lab and sipped it with wine while he worked. On February 2nd, 1685, he woke up gravely ill after a stroke and reached for it immediately. His doctors poured 40 drops a day down his throat. He did die 4 days later on February 6th, and some historians think the drops actually made things worse.
He wasn't the only one either. A decade later, in 1695, Queen Mary II was dying of smallpox. Her doctors pulled out the exact same remedy, poured the king's drops down her throat and on her deathbed. Same medicine, same outcome.
But this wasn't just limited to palaces. At public executions, crowds physically rushed to the scaffold, trying to catch the blood of the condemned while it was still warm. Apothecaries ran out of mummy powder so fast that dealers in Alexandria started manufacturing fakes, grabbing the bodies of executed criminals and slaves, packing them into bitumen, baking them in the sun, and shipping them to Europe labeled as ancient Egyptian mummies. When a French physician named Guy Lafontaine investigated in 1564, the main dealer didn't even pretend otherwise.
James I was prescribed powdered skull by his own royal physician and refused it. Charles II made his own in a lab, and Charles I, after his execution in 1649, was turned into it. The crowd soaked cloths in his blood and carried them home as cures.
3 kings, same family,
and one said no,
one made it, one became it.
So what finally killed the corpse medicine?
Here's what most people assume. They assume that at some point, everyone just looked around, realized how disgusting it all was, and it stopped. But that's not actually how it happened.
The theory died first. In the 1700s, newer ideas about autonomy, chemistry, and how the body actually heals started replacing Paracelsus and the old framework. Vital spirit didn't hold up once people could actually observe what was happening inside the human body. Doctors stopped prescribing corpse medicine because science moved on, not because the squeamishness kicked in.
The horror came later. Once the theory collapsed, people looked back and couldn't process what they'd been doing. But while it was alive, nobody blinked. A king carried it in a pouch. Another king brewed it in his lab. Bacon and Boyle put their names behind it in writing. None of these people were stupid, and none of them thought they were doing anything wrong. They were just following the best advice available to them at the time.
That's the part worth sitting with. Every era has something like this. Some practice that the smartest people alive believed in completely, backed by the best science they've got, that a future generation is going to look back on with their jaws dropping to the floor. We just can't see it when we're there. And if you like this kind of royal history, let us know in the comments what you'd like to know next.
Welcome to Crownology,
where we discover real stories
behind the crown.
Don't forget to subscribe.